If you're confused about Rome Odunze's sudden fantasy collapse, you really shouldn't be. The warning signs have been there the entire time. Almost 5 months ago, on this very channel, I broke down the data and exposed the truth about Rome Odunze, and the 2025 season is playing out almost exactly as the metrics had suggested. The part nobody caught? Well, it was hidden in his 2024 analytics. In this video, we are going to look at the offseason narrative versus the actual data, why his production suddenly fell off a cliff this season, and how to spot the next fantasy landmine before it blows up your roster. What made me want to dive into the data and analyze Rome Odunze was the narrative this offseason that the community seemed to hold, where the wide receiver one in this Bears offense was just absolutely guaranteed to be a difference-making fantasy producer. However, as we know, being a wide receiver one in an offense does not guarantee any type of fantasy production. Look at the Ravens, look at the Bills. And so my issue with this narrative is I felt like it significantly limited the conversation to who would be the wide receiver one and not how do all of these receivers actually project in such a crowded wide receiver room. So my original question was simple. How valuable an asset is the Bears wide receiver one actually going to be in 2025? The second narrative that I wanted to touch on is about Rome Odunze specifically. The commonly held belief in the offseason was that Rome Odunze's lack of production was driven predominantly by his lack of opportunity, that he was being hidden behind Keenan Allen and DJ Moore, and that he just in general had poor usage. However, when we take a second and actually look at his 2024 data, we see that he had 552 routes run, which not only puts him at 13th among wide receivers in the league, it also puts him at second among rookie wide receivers on a per game basis behind only Neighbors. His route participation was also very solid at 87.2% on the season, and he netted 101 total targets with a target share of 19.2%. So while Rome Odunze did not have the optimal opportunity or usage, he actually did have significantly more opportunity than a player like JSN in his rookie season. And so this begs the question, why wasn't Rome Odunze more productive in 2024? And the short answer is his efficiency. In 2024, Odunze had 13.6 yards per reception, 33rd in the NFL, but only 7.3 yards per target, which put him at 79th in the NFL. So Odunze was efficient when he had a reception, but significantly less efficient when we were looking on a per target basis. With 101 targets on the season, but only 54 receptions, Odunze simply wasn't catching enough of his targets. The culprit was his low catchable target rate at 58.4%. Odunze did have an average true catch rate of 91%, but his low catchable target rate was just really limiting his production and his efficiency. Let's talk a little bit more about catchable target rate. The premise of catchable and uncatchable targets is not too difficult to understand, but the question is whether or not it is an important metric and can it be used to make predictions about fantasy production and outlook moving forward. Now, don't worry. I spent over 10 hours studying catchable target rates so that you don't have to. And what I found is that catchable target rate can actually be a very sticky statistic from one year to the next. There are three main factors at play. First is average depth of target, or ADOT. A higher ADOT means longer passes, more difficult routes, and more defenders between the receiver and the quarterback. High ADOT players in general have lower catchable target rates. The second important piece is the quarterback who's throwing the ball, which of course is pretty obvious. The better your QB is as a passer, the more on-target throws and the more receptions your receiver will be able to catch. The important piece here is that the biggest jumps in catchable target rate for pass catchers come with quarterback changes, like Terry McLaurin with Jaden Daniels' rookie year. While QBs can improve over time, the season-to-season changes that we see in catchable target rate is relatively small. The third and least impactful of the three is route separation. Simply put, the more open a player gets, the easier it is to make a throw. And so players who get more open get more receptions on average and have more catchable targets. Applying these three factors to Rome Odunze specifically, he had a high ADOT in 2024 at 13.8, which makes sense because he is a downfield, big play, X receiver. That is and has been Odunze's game ever since he was in college. He is a high ADOT player, so naturally he would have a lower catchable target rate than other receivers with lower average depth of target. He was also unlikely to see a large increase in short yardage work in 2025 because he was on the field with guys like DJ Moore, Colston Loveland, Luther Burden, and DeAndre Swift, who all work that portion of the field and do it more efficiently than Rome Odunze. His QB wasn't going to change either heading into 2025. So even though we were expecting Caleb Williams to take a step up as a passer, the year-to-year improvements in catchable target rate based on quarterback development are still minimal, again, from year to year. Over time, it could improve, but just from one year to another, those changes are minimal. And even if Odunze were to improve his route separation and be more open, it is the least impactful factor out of the three when it comes to looking at catchable target changes. So the prediction this offseason was that his catchable target rate would likely increase, but not to a large enough degree to significantly impact his fantasy production. And as predicted, his ADOT is still high at 13.9 on the season, and his catchable target rate has only increased by 5% to 63.3. We have established that Odunze had a fairly decent opportunity share in his rookie season. However, he was inefficient due to the large number of uncatchable targets. And this was a big reason why I was not excited about his production in 2025. But I know what you're thinking. There are other ways to increase fantasy production. Couldn't he get more targets per game or increase his efficiency per reception? Absolutely. Hypothetically, could do both of those things, but there's a limit to how much those factors can increase for any player. Even if Odunze's targets increased from 101 to 150 in 2025, which would put him around the top 5 in receivers in the entire league, he would still, if nothing else changed in terms of his efficiency, only score about 13.5 fantasy points per game. And so even if Odunze saw a fairly large increase in targets, then he would still have some deficiencies in his game that would limit his fantasy production. In terms of his per reception efficiency, which is another area that he could hypothetically increase, the two ways that you increase your efficiency per reception would be average depth of target, getting passes sent further down the field, or yards after catch. In terms of his ADOT, Odunze was already 11th in the league in 2024 in terms of average depth of target. And so this is another factor that was pretty much maxed out for a player like Rome Odunze. JSN significantly increased his ADOT from 2024 to 2025, and that is a big reason why he has been significantly more effective. However, JSN started out at a significantly lower average depth of target. And so he actually had plenty of room to increase his route tree and start making plays down the field. However, since Odunze is already such a downfield threat, he doesn't have much room to grow in that category. The other category would then be the yards after catch. Unfortunately, significant yak ability has never been part of Odunze's game, and so it would be highly unlikely for him to develop yak ability at this point in his career. So we had all these factors that we expected to improve for Odunze in 2025. Better passing, increased volume, improvement in route running and separation, as well as better play calling. But quantifying how all of those factors can come together and result in increased production can be quite difficult. What I did was look at past data and estimate above average improvements in each of these areas, using his rookie year metrics as a baseline. But since he started out at only 8.8 points per game, and he was capped in his room for growth in many of these categories, I could only project him out for 12 to 13 points per game, realistically. Many analysts were trying to project out the Bears' receiving room and had a common problem. They were giving Odunze a somewhat realistic number of targets, but at the same time, they were also giving Odunze a catch rate of 75% or higher. That's roughly a 20% higher catch rate than the data would suggest. So they were overestimating his ceiling by up to 35%. I came to realize that it would take fairly extreme circumstances for Odunze to be a difference-making fantasy producer in 2025. So then why did Rome start the 2025 season so hot, and why was it so easy to predict his downfall? It comes down to the Bears' offensive circumstances during that time, which I would classify as extreme. The Bears' rushing attack was practically non-existent. During the first 4 weeks, their combined running back rushing yards per game was 53, 91, 49, and 56. Over the next 4 weeks following the bye, their running back yards per game were 127 rushing yards, 205, 69, nice, and 176 running back rushing yards per game. So, over the first 4 weeks, the backfield averaged 62.25 yards on the ground, whereas over the next 4 games, they more than doubled to 144 yards per game. And so not only was the running game weak early on in the season, but also the 2 high draft capital rookie pass catchers in Colston Loveland and Luther Burden were yet to see the field with any sort of consistency and really begin drawing targets. The receiving core at that time was made up of Odunze, DJ Moore, Zacchaeus, and Cole Kmet. So Odunze was in the perfect position as the clear wide receiver 1 of an offense with mediocre ancillary pass catchers, no ground game, and negative game scripts, which lead to pushing the ball downfield, which was beneficial for a big play, high ADOT player like Rome Odunze. And with this incredibly advantageous situation, Odunze wasn't actually impressive statistically. Sure, he was drawing a fair number of targets, around 10 per game, and averaged 19.9 fantasy points per game, but his efficiency on those targets was mediocre at best, and his fantasy production was being propped up by 5 touchdowns in 4 games. For reference, 5 touchdowns over 4 games increases your fantasy production by 8.5 points per game. One of my favorite fantasy football channels to watch praised Rome as being one of the most consistent and dependable wide receivers through the first 4 weeks of this NFL season. And then just a few minutes later was saying to sell Michael Pittman because 3 touchdowns in 4 weeks was simply unsustainable. This just goes to show that our own personal biases can really end up clouding our evaluation of players. Why wasn't he having the same thought process about Rome Odunze's high number of touchdowns and similar production profile? Pittman and Odunze's stat lines were markedly similar through 4 weeks this season, but Odunze was being valued as a top 8 wide receiver in redraft leagues, and Pittman was barely being ranked in the top 24. This is just another instance of narrative overriding the actual data. Now let's talk about Odunze's production falling off the cliff. Not only did the touchdown regression hit Odunze particularly hard, but his targets decreased as well, with Loveland and Burden being integrated into this offense. Not to mention the rushing attack coming alive just simply limited the production available for this passing attack. These factors were all fairly predictable as well. I even had Odunze in a buy-sell video around the time of week 4 where I outlined each of these 3 factors as reasons to sell on Rome Odunze. However, even I didn't expect Odunze's production to fall off this quickly, this fast. Since the bye, he's scoring just 8.3 fantasy points per game. Now that we know what happened with Rome Odunze and why, the burning question is how to avoid similar mistakes and landmines in the future. The first and easiest step that each of you should do is drop a like and subscribe so that you can see my content in the future, because I will continue to do in-depth player analysis during the offseason that will give you a ton of insight for 2026. And if there are any particular players that you would like me to do an analysis on, then drop that down in the comments and I would be happy to oblige. The next piece of advice is don't let hype or your personal biases take over your decision-making process. Really, you should be being very careful when taking players way above their statistical tier. And so if the data is not supporting a player being drafted that high, then you are really leaving yourself open to being let down by those players. I'm all for taking shots on players that you believe in, but if you want to be more successful at fantasy football, then you should root your decisions in data first, and then when it's applicable and reasonable, go with those players that you really want to pick. I learned my lesson last year with Tank Dell. He was one of my favorite players his rookie season, and last year I drafted him too early and too often. And as I'm sure you all know, I got fairly burned drafting a lot of Tank Dell. Next up is questioning narratives. Simply by questioning the narrative that the wide receiver one in Chicago was going to be a very productive fantasy asset this season, I feel like that gave me a significant leg up on the rest of the fantasy market. And this is one that is very easy to do as long as you remain curious and suspicious. And lastly, analysis within a situation can oftentimes be more useful than season-long analysis. Rome is still likely to finish as a wide receiver 2 on the season because he has scored so many points in the first 4 weeks and played every single game. But since the bye, he has been borderline unstartable for your fantasy teams. A lot of analysts have been saying that you just can't dismiss Odunze's first 4 games when evaluating his rest of season outlook or his future, and I get that. If you take away any player's best games, they're going to look worse. However, if you take into account major shifts in an offensive situation, just like we talked about before, a lot changed for the Bears between weeks 4 and week 6. I think it's more fair and better analysis to split the different situations and evaluate each separately, taking into account the change in circumstances. For example, if we were trying to evaluate Rashid Shaheed rest of season, he did very well on the Saints, getting a good amount of target volume and being fantasy productive. He was, for the first several weeks of the season, a very solid flex play for your team. However, now that he's been traded over to the Seahawks, his situation has drastically changed. And of course, this is a more extreme example. Another example would be a player like T. Higgins. With Joe Burrow back under center, it wouldn't really be applicable to use his fantasy production and metrics while Jake Browning and Joe Flacco were under center, because Burrow being back in the offense really is a drastic change for T. Higgins. And I simply believe that the change in the Bears offense, while not as big a change as someone like Rashid Shaheed or T. Higgins, is still a significant enough change that we have to look at these two separate parts of the season in different categories. Clearly, Rome Odunze's targets have dropped since the bye, but not only that, his ADOT has actually increased from the start of the season. The first 4 games, his ADOT was only 11.9, hinting that he was seeing just a little bit more short yardage looks. However, since then, his ADOT is back up to 15, which shows that he has been pushed back downfield. So when you are analyzing players, it can be helpful to look at some specific situations over season-long performances. With that, the case study is over. If there is a player that you would like me to do an analysis of next, let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, or at least thought it was informative, drop a like and subscribe so you can stay up to date with my content.